morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Tom Work, and I'm the proprietor of Work Communications and the publisher of Fermentation Newsletter on Substack. I'm going to be the moderator for today's webinar. First, thank you all very much for attending today. You are at the webinar exploring the past, the present, and the future of winemaking with native North American wine grapes. This is a little talked about subject in the United States today, but it's one that's generating a good deal more interest inside the American wine industry in Europe and with consumers who are looking to explore U.S. winemaking that sits on the perimeter of what is considered standard. There are not a lot of people in the U.S. who could be considered experts in the area of North American native varieties, but we have three of them today who are together going to draw a picture for you of the history of native North American grapes, how they were established, and most importantly, how they're being used today to produce fine wines. So today I'd like to introduce you to the presenters. First, we have Jerry Eisterhold. Jerry is one of America's foremost museum designers. He's also the founder of TerraVox Vineyards, located outside Kansas City, Missouri, where since 1996, he's actively farmed over 80 different North American native grapes with the intent of discerning which are best suited to form the foundation of a collection of native North American wines. Since 2015, TerraVox Vineyards has been among the sole commercial producers of wine from native North American grapes. We also have with us today Stephen Castles. Stephen is a Hudson Valley horticulturalist with 45 years experience in growing grapes and other fruits, in presenting papers and lectures on the history of fruit culture and horticulture in the New York and New England area. Stephen is also the author of Grapes of the Hudson Valley and Other Cool Climate Regions of the United States and Canada, and he's an advisor to the New York Wine and Grape Foundation. And finally, we have Clark Smith. Clark has worked in the wine industry since 1972, creating for himself a reputation as one of the most innovative and thoughtful people in the industry. Clark is the founder of Vinovation, a company which brought European innovations, including micro-oxidation, ultrafiltration, oak alternatives, and reverse osmosis to the United States. He is the author of the influential Postmodern Winemaking, and Clark has worked with TerraVox Vineyards for several years, where he consults with Jerry on the commercial and the theoretical aspects of the TerraVox projects. The panelists hope to make very efficient use of your time as they present their information, but we're also leaving time at the end to respond to questions. When you have a question, please write it in the Q&A box you see below the player. Be sure to note who you'd like to direct the question to, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So again, thank you for being here today. And with that, I'd like to bring on Stephen Castles, who's going to start us off with an introduction to what is meant when we talk about native North American grapes.
There you go. Thank you, Tom. Yes, I'm going to talk today about what a native North American grape variety is. Tom, could you go to the next slide? And thank you for doing that. I'm the author of just a little background on me. I'm the author of this book, Grapes of the Hudson Valley, which is now out in a second edition. And the reason I bring this up to the attention of the audience today is that the two new chapters are about grapes that were developed in the New England area. And one of those chapters is about a fellow by the name of Edward Rogers of Salem, Massachusetts, who developed grapes in the 1850s and 1860s. And for our purposes, what's very important about this fellow is that many of the grapes that were developed by Thomas Munson of Texas, which is part of what the TerraVox project is, are component parts of that. So many of these Rogers grapes were used by Munson to create his own varieties that are now being used by the TerraVox program. So I thought that might be of interest to you, so you have an idea of what Munson was trying to do when he was breeding grapes. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about what is a native North American grape variety, where they came from, and I'll talk for about 10 minutes on that. Clark Smith is now then going to talk on the significance and implications of the North American wine sector. Then I will come back on and then talk very briefly about a history of native North American grape varieties and where they were grown in the US and the world. So without further ado, what is a native North American grape variety and where do they come from? What you're going to find is that most of these grapes, I mean, they what they are is they're very much involved with people. It was people who selected these things or bred them or found them in the wild, identified them and propagated them. So this is really very much a people business as far as what is a native North American grape variety. There's from the 1820s until about 1920, there was really three ways in which these varieties were created. The first way was really between, like, say, the 1820s and 1870s. These were spontaneously created grape varieties. So what you did is you had a person who would find a grape variety that was indigenous, and what an indigenous grape variety is something that's found like on a roadside or in the backyard or a riverbank or on top of a mountain. And what happened was they would then those grapes were then crossbred accidentally with vinifera grapes, which are grapes that were from Europe. And what happened is that many people in the US from the 1820s to the 1880s were importing vinifera grape varieties to grow. They did not grow here for the harsh climate that the US had, and they would mostly die within about 3 or 4 years of existence. So, but what they did do is that when they were alive for those 3 or 4 years, their pollen would then go to indigenous varieties, and then a hybrid was created that would then become a new grape variety. So example, actually, can you go to the next slide, Tom, which is the Delaware grape? So this is a copy of a grape that I go called Delaware. This was a variety that was found in a hedgerow near someone's house in Ohio. And what happened was that you had a native variety, indigenous variety, that was cross-pollinated by a European variety, and which begot grapes that had seeds that then fell on the ground and then started propagating themselves. So this is what would be called a spontaneously derived Native American hybrid. So that's what Delaware is. And the story behind this grape is that the fellow who found it was in Ohio. He then gave cuttings to this fellow, to Downing, who was a horticulturalist in the Newburgh, New York area, who identified it as like a new grape variety that was superior, that should be propagated by nursery people across the United States. So he did it that way. But what you're going to find out in the end is that it was an accidental hybrid that was created in someone's backyard where they combined by accident or by nature a Vitis vinifera variety and with an indigenous American variety. So that's what that is right there. So that's the first way these things were created. Maybe Tom, could you do the next slide, the agawam slide? The second way these things are created was not spontaneously by accident and finding it in someone's backyard and then propagating it. What you found from the 1840s until, at least for our time period, to the 1920s, is that people were purposefully developing and trying to create grape varieties. So you have people who were trying to create grape varieties, and later on during our talk, we'll talk about why they were trying to create these grapes. So what you'll find is that people like they were trying to hybridize European grape varieties, which had superior flavors, with indigenous grape varieties that had better cultural abilities to grow in the United States. So examples of these kind of purposeful hybrids are like the grape Concord, which was developed by Ephraim Bull of Concord, Massachusetts. Ricketts of Newburgh developed grapes like, say, Jefferson. And then we talked about Rogers before, who's from the Salem, Massachusetts area. He also developed grape varieties like this one, Agawam, right here, which was, again, a combination of a European grape variety, a local grape variety, to create something that would like be good, that could grow here, but also have superior fruits. So that's the second way that these grapes were created. The third way was the same mechanism as far as breeding the grape varieties, but what you had was like, it was not trying to breed in a European grape with an indigenous American grape. They were trying to crossbreed two indigenous American grape varieties to make something. So grape species like Estivalis and Labrusca and Riparia were crossbred. So an example of that would be a grape called Elvira, which was developed by a Jacob Rummel from Morrison, Missouri. So again, same idea that they didn't have enough grapes that they could grow that were sustainable or that had good qualities as far as growing or culture. So they tried to do them. So the first way was like they found in the backyard, but they liked it and then planted it or got cuttings for it. The second way was they crossbred purposely a European and an indigenous variety. And the third way is like crossbreeding two indigenous varieties and doing it that way. So like to do now is speak about why were these grapes retained. What people were doing when they were finding these spontaneous grape varieties or purposely breeding, what they were trying to do is find varieties that could grow in the United States. And up to like say the 1860s, there was not many varieties that really could be grown successfully in the United States. So when you were selecting these varieties, whether they're purposely bred or just found next to the side of the road, what they wanted to make sure that they had enhanced like fungus disease resistance, they were more productive, they had like a bigger berry, or they could be or a better flavor profile for making wine or table grapes. If they wanted to have them for marketing grapes that could be shipped, they want to make sure they could ship well. And I think what you're finding, so that was the main thing. So like there were goals of why they were trying to create these things. I think what I would do is add to that list right now, and this is part of what the TerraVox project is about, and is my understanding is at least, is that what you're seeing is that we're revisiting these older native North American grape varieties because of our changing climate. And what's happening with our changing climate now is that we have more droughts, more floods, warmer falls, followed by a polar vortex, late springs with an Arctic blast. So what you're seeing is we're looking at the past to try and find grape varieties that might be suitable for our current climates as far as growing things that way. So that will be added. And that's one of the values of the TerraVox project and some of the work that I've been doing is like finding grapes in the Hudson Valley and the New England areas, which like, even though they were bypassed, they have such value now because they're able to, they can be grown much more sustainably. One thing I like to talk about just to kind of, I guess, clarify what a native North American grape variety is and what it isn't. We've all heard about French American hybrids. So grapes like Baco, Chelois, Saval, Vidal. What distinguishes Native American grape varieties from these French American hybrids is that while the stories are saying that breeders in the US and in France were purposely breeding grapes, they had different reasons for why they were breeding grapes. In France, the French American hybrids, the difficulty that they were having is that what had been imported from the US were certain bugs and phylloxera, which is a root louse, and then also a winged one, and then also to a lot of fungus diseases like black rot and downy mildew and powdery mildew. And what happened with those pests and funguses were imported to Europe, it decimated the vinifera or European grape varieties in that country. As an example, so most of the vineyards were infected and were dead within 15 years. And to give you an idea of how important the grape industry was in France, is that in 1860, about 30% of the GMP of France was winemaking. Because again, the water wasn't safe to drink and they were exporting a lot of wine. So a third of the economy was falling apart. So what French winemakers were doing, or breeders were doing, is they were taking their grapes that they grew and knew and then hybridizing with American grapes so that they can have a French grape that would have the disease resistance of an American variety. So that's kind of what they were doing. So while in the US, they were trying to have things bring in European flavors to things that were able to grow in the US. The same thing was happening in France, only the other way around. They were trying to like rebuild their vineyards because most of them had died out that way. So I guess in conclusion, what I'm hoping I was able to do today in my first part here is talk about what a native North American grape variety is, where they came from, and the reasons why they were planted widespread. So what I'd like to do right now is now turn this over to Clark Smith, who's going to talk about the significance and implications of the North American wine sector. So thank you very much, and go get him, Clark.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. I am going to try to put all of what he said in context here and talk about why you should care. I want you to feel like it was worth your time to come on and look at this webinar. So I'm going to go over the implications of some of the things that Steve has said and the significance of the North American wine sector. First thing you got to realize is there's a huge diversity of offerings, and I'll go over the different types of grapes that we're talking about. The muscadines, a grape called Norton, the Munson hybrids, and the Svensson hybrids all have very different properties and climates that they love. So because they're Native American, they have natural advantages for adaptation, sort of as Steve has already described. And in particular, great importance for climate change. Now, we think of that as global warming, but in fact, we get an awful lot of chilling events at lower and lower temperatures. And many of these grapes are much, much more tolerant than Vitis vinifera. And so we can plant them in places where we just can't grow vinifera. And in particular, they have a lot of pest and disease resistance because they came from the United States, and therefore we're going to need to use less chemicals in the vineyard and have more resistance to different kinds of both pests and mildews and other kinds of disease. So let's start by looking about where Vitis vinifera is grown in the United States. So there's all along the West Coast and through southern Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and out on the Snake River. That's West Coast vinifera, and we really can't get outside of that zone. Over here, we're looking around the Great Lakes, Michigan, South Shore of Lake Erie, and up into New York State and Pennsylvania, right along the lake. So that moderating effect of water is very important because it keeps the winter temperatures higher than minus 10 degrees. No vinifera can live at, some of them can't even get to -5, but minus 10 is about the limit for some of the more tolerant vinifers like Riesling. And then again, along the Atlantic seaboard from Georgia all the way up to New York State and a little bit in Connecticut, we again have the moderating influence, this time of the Atlantic Ocean. And then I'll mention there's this one little spot in Palisade in Colorado where most of their vinifera are grown. And that's about it for where you can grow vinifera in the United States. And these regions are even shrinking due to climate change. So you can see it leaves a vast amount of the United States where you can't grow vinifera. So now let's look at why these grapes can't make it there. One thing is, as I mentioned, the poor temperature adaptability. There's a disease called Pierce's disease that's borne by sharpshooter leafhoppers. It's a bacterium that gets into vinifera vines and kills them. And then we need to use petrochemicals to control downy mildew and many other kinds of fungal diseases. And finally, they're not resistant to the winged form of phylloxera. Most vinifera grapes in the regions that I just shown you are actually grafted onto Native American rootstocks, but that strategy doesn't really work if the wing form is present. We don't really see that form in California, for example, but we do see plenty of it in the Midwest. And I've circled there. This is a vine called Albania, and I've circled the pock marks there that are left by the wing form of phylloxera. But you can see that this Albania vine is perfectly healthy, even though it's a host to the winged form. So now, where can we grow these other varieties? Well, to begin with, in the deep south, we've got a lot of high temperatures and humidity, and that's where we can grow the muscadines. They do pretty well in the swamp. They can handle all kinds of fungal diseases and insects, and they also are very much tolerant to these heavy insect pressures. Then a grape called Norton was discovered in about 1820 in the woods in Virginia by a guy named Norton. He actually originally named it after his daughter, and so it was known as Cynthiana for a long time. But then after he died, people often would use the name Norton in deference to him. It's grown in Virginia and North Carolina, but it's also the state grape of the state of Missouri. There's a lot of good Nortons grown there, and including a wonderful one on Vox Vineyards on Jerry's estate. I grow Norton in Clarksburg with the Herringer family, and as far as I know, I make the only Norton table wine in California, but I find California is a wonderful place to grow Norton, and so I hope people can get beyond the vinifera bias and start looking at grapes like this that really do extremely well in our warm, dry climate. Okay, so the Munson varieties were collected and bred in Texas by T.V. Munson, and now they're grown in this area that I'm showing you here. We don't really know where else the Munson varieties could be grown, but I'm going to speculate that they would do pretty well in the vinifera zones. And so it could be that we could grow vinifera all over the country. But the original circle that I showed you there is just where they're being grown now. And I think there's a lot of potential for that to spread out. So then Stephen mentioned the French American hybrids, Chambourcin. There's pretty good. Help me out here, Steve.
Vidal?
Yeah, Vidal, Sèvres Blanc, sure.
Bosch.
And so that's where those grapes are grown now. And all of these grapes have a resistance down to about minus 20 degrees. So one of the reasons that Norton is grown all over is because of its pest resistance and disease resistance. It doesn't always get ripe, and it's a pretty high acid variety. And so not every Norton rises to the standard of a great wine, but when it can get ripe, for example, on Jerry's property, he's got about 600 feet of glacial till, and so his heat capacity of the soils is very low. They warm up quite easily, and then he can get his Norton ripe and make a really nice wine. So then we have the cold tolerant varieties. There was this guy named Elmer Svensson. And if you want to know about Elmer, get your hands on the movie Wine Diamonds. And they talk about his work there quite a bit. He bred in Wisconsin and then started working with the University of Minnesota. They've taken over his work and added to the Svensson varieties a bunch of new varieties like Talco and Petite Pearl that are the next generation beyond the Svensson varieties. And we now have something like 40 really nice red and white varieties that you would never guess were not vinifera. So what are we talking about here? I'm a big fan of La Crescent. I really think a good Iowa La Crescent is a better wine than anything we make in California because it's just nice and fresh and fruity, low alcohol, good acidity. Petite Pearl is another one that makes a big, rich red wine. And then in Cornell, they were doing the same thing. And there are a whole bunch of Cornell varieties like Aramella. It's a big favorite of mine. And those are now grown in these areas where we need the varieties to be able to tolerate 40 below. And so you can see that all this area where we couldn't grow vinifera is now being covered by all these different Native American varieties. That's why they're so important. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Stephen to talk about the history of these varieties.
Okay. Thank you, Clark. So maybe bring it or leave it. Let me just check one thing. We'll just leave it at the current slide of Lindley. That would be great. So thanks, Clark. What I'm going to talk about now for the next 10 minutes is the history of native North American grape varieties in the U.S. and the world. And this is kind of the first part of the talk was really like how are they created and what was the reason for creating them and who created them. What this really is going to outline the people that created them, the places where they were done, and the purposes for these different grape varieties. That's what I'm going to do right now. And there's this variation of the thing, whether they're chance hybrids or purposely developed hybrids. What people in the United States were trying to do is they were trying to maximize their fungus disease resistance. Uh, Compared to vinifera, the U.S. has hotter and more humid summers, more frigid winters. Also, we have much more insect pests in the United States. So what you're going to find is that when you're figuring out where to plant these varieties in different parts of the U.S., first you have to breed these new varieties, new in the 1840s, but then you have to figure out what areas of the country they're suitable for planting. So that's what I'm going to spend a bit of my time talking about. So and again, kind of going back to the purposeful breeders and stuff like that. What you're going to find is that the American breeders are actually at this much earlier than the French breeders. Because the French breeders got to doing these things because they had phylloxera and other things that were decimating their vineyards in the 1880s. While in the U.S., and from like in 1800 forward, they were trying to find grape varieties that could grow in the U.S. That's what they were really trying to do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to outline the areas of the U.S. which specialize in breeding grapes, and then I'm going to talk about those areas where those grapes are grown currently or where they had grown in the past. One thing you're going to find that's kind of interesting is that most of the breeding that was done in the U.S. is actually done by private individuals. So there's really four areas that had a concentration of breeders, and these are very special areas because, as an example, I'll use Eastern Massachusetts as the first one. There were areas that had growers that could grow these things, breeders who wanted to breed them, but very importantly, you had to have nurseries that would propagate and sell these varieties, and also you wanted to have a publishing industry nearby so you could like print catalogs and books. And then many of these people were organized in horticultural societies. So, for instance, like in the Eastern Massachusetts area, one of the biggest national horticultural societies was the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Level we call that Mass Hort. The growers and the breeders in the New England area, north of Boston, like around Cape Ann, what their goal is basically in the 1820s, the only grape varieties that you could really grow in the U.S. were like Catawba and Isabella, which came from the South originally. So the New England area had a much shorter growing season. So the breeders in the New England area, what they were trying to do is breed quality grapes that would include all the things that we've talked about before about fungus disease resistance, winter hardiness, productivity, quality. But the main thing they were after is they were trying to find varieties or create varieties that could ripen a shorter growing season in New England. So that's what they did. So maybe Tom, we can go to the next slide, which is Jefferson. And just the early one that Lindley that was used extensively by Munson. So there's quite a few done that way. The next area that had a high concentration of breeders and horticultural talent was the Mid Hudson Valley area, which is actually where I'm from, which is the Newburgh, New York area. And again, you had the same thing. You had breeders, growers, horticulturalists, societies, publishers, printers, all within the same area. Like many of the breeders lived in Newburgh, New York, and they lived only like 3 blocks from each other. They were all Episcopals. They went to the same church, and afterwards they talked about grapes. That's what they did. So it was like kind of initially a hobby, and then it kind of became more than that way. So in the Hudson Valley, these breeders, and again, this is one example here, which is Jefferson, which is done by Ricketts. You had guys like Ricketts who developed Jefferson. Kaywood did like Duchess, and you had Grant who did Iona, which we'll talk about later on down the line. So what the Hudson Valley growers were trying to do, or their problem was they lived near New York City. So what they were trying to do is create that holy grail of grapes, the dual purpose grape variety. So basically it could be used as a table grape like Jefferson, or it could be used as a fine wine grape. So they wanted, again, all the same things we talked about earlier, is like disease resistance, winter hardiness, productivity. But what the Hudson Valley people were trying to do is create a dual purpose grape that was good in the field, that like looked pretty, but also made a good quality wine. So Tom, go to the next slide if you could. This is a great quote. And I grow all these grapes, and these are actually my pictures from my little cell phones. That's what these things came from. So, and I try not to touch them up because I'm incapable of doing that, because I'm not technically savvy enough to do that. So this is a grape called Empire State, which is also done by Ricketts. The first one, Jefferson, was a true dual purpose grape variety. Empire State is a good wine grape, but it ships okay, so it's kind of a table grape too. So he tried to do both, but it didn't work out this way. This is more of a wine grape, but it does have some application for the table. So Tom, go to the next slide if you could. This is Bacchus. There's a Bacchus that was created in Germany, which is a hybrid, which is a white variety. This was done by Ricketts in the give you time like 1870s. So this was truly a wine grape. The clusters aren't that pretty, but it was a good wine grape that had high sugars, some tannin profiles, nice flavor profiles, so did it that way. So kind of looking at what just look at my thing here. Sorry again here. Okay. Yeah. So in so you have an idea, in the Hudson Valley, they were trying to do these dual purpose grapes. So what I'm going to do now is go to the Missouri area. That's the next area of concentration of breeding of these varieties. And what you could do now, Tom, is go to slide 20, which is Bush and those guys. Yeah, and keep this on there for a little while there. The Missouri area, which is actually getting closer to the Terravox territory, was another center of knowledge for horticultural studies. So in this area, you had guys like Isidore Bush, which is important, and Engelman and Jaeger and Riley. But again, you had the same thing. You had people who were like breeders, people who were horticulturalists, botanists, a publishing industry, so that you could broadcast these things, and nursery people who could then propagate them and send them throughout the country. So Missouri was an important area for developing grape varieties, but also it's a very important area for also growing grapes. So around the Civil War, the biggest area for growing grapes, believe it or not, was not California, it was not New York, it was Missouri. So it was around the St. Louis area, so Herman, Augusta, that kind of stuff. And that has since gone down a little bit, but I think it's starting to come back a little bit that way. Trying to give an example of like the importance that Missouri had for I guess identifying these grape varieties, propagating them, and actually growing them is like the first one I'll talk about is Isidore Bush. Most of these people who know us have came initially from what would become Germany or Central Europe. They came here generally after like 1848. But Bush was important because he had a nursery business. He propagated these varieties, but most importantly, he had a catalog. And in this catalog, it talked about how to grow grapes, how to make wine, and he had probably over 1,000 different grape varieties that he was propagating and selling. Many of these grape varieties were unknown to many other people, but it was a national catalog that was used by other nurseries to propagate their own material as far as that. So in Missouri, it's very important. So like all the catalogs and all the research was done was basically by private people by private people as opposed to universities. Um, And then what we'll do is we'll just say, okay, and like Engelman was a viticulturist, and we could go to the next slide if we could, Tom. There we go. So Hussman was another fellow who was from the Missouri area. He was a viticulturist. Rommel was a fellow. Remember we talked before about creating grapes and when you cross two indigenous species. Elvira is an example of an indigenous species because he was trying to get quality, but he really wanted to get something that was very resistant to diseases. So he took two indigenous American varieties, crossed them, and got Elvira. So he had done that. So the other thing that happened in Missouri, and I'm spending quite a bit of time in Missouri because we're starting to get into the Terravox area of the country. So the other thing that happened was there was a fellow by the name of Herman Jaeger. And what he did was he was specializing in basically going in the wild and finding wild grape varieties because he figured he wanted to kind of sort of like Engelman, who was a botanist, they were trying to categorize what these grape varieties were so they could know what their growing attributes were. And then when the phylloxera epidemic broke out in Europe, both T.V. Munson, who we'll talk in a second, and Jaeger were the leaders in the U.S. and in France in identifying Native American rootstocks that were resistant to all the diseases that were occurring in France, sending them over there and then doing the rootstocks. So you're going to find out that many of the rootstocks that are still used in France are ones that were identified in the wild by Jaeger and by Munson. So that's why the Missouri area is a very important area of concentration when it came to spreading horticultural knowledge. And again, when you're spreading it, it's basically you have to learn it, understand it, make sure it's right, but you have to publish it and you have to be able to ship out plants. So that's what they did. So it isn't like they theoretically figured out what it was. They actually did the work and they were actually had the capability to have nurseries to disseminate the knowledge and then to ship out those plants. The next one we'll go to, if we can go to the next slide, Tom. And thank you again for doing that, Tom. Is T.V. Munson, Thomas Volney Munson. Now he was an area concentration all onto himself. He was the only person who worked in this area. He worked in an area called Denison, Texas, which is I think near the Red River Valley, which is near Oklahoma. I think it's in that area right there. And what T.V. Munson did is kind of like the earlier fellows, is that when I talk about the people in New England, what they were trying to do was breed to have like a shorter a grape that could grow in a shorter season. In the Hudson Valley, they were trying to get grapes that could be dual purpose grapes that could be shipped to New York City to the market. They all had their problems and they were trying to address by breeding. What you're going to find that T.V. Munson did was like he lived in Texas, so he wanted to hybridize grape varieties that would live in the western Midwest states and the plain states. So that's what he did. So, and he found that most of his work was like from the 1880s forward. Most of the eastern developed grapes in Massachusetts and New York were not suitable. They were okay, but they grew okay, but he wanted to have ones that would actually much more match the climate and the growing conditions of the Texas area where he was from. So he spent a lot of time. He developed over 300 different grape varieties that Jerry will talk a little bit later on as far as what's in the Terravox program. The grapes that he developed were grapes like Brilliant, Captivator, Delago, which is a Delaware hybrid. So you saw the picture of Delaware. It's a hybrid of Delaware. Hidalgo, I think, has some, or Captivator has like a lot of Rogers grapes in it in that way. So, but the other thing Munson was trying to do is he liked the idea of either a commercial venture or a private individual having fresh grapes throughout most of the year. So he developed grape varieties so that some would ripen on Labor Day, some would ripen on September 5th, some on the 10th, some in October, so that ideally you could have 20 vines and have fresh grapes on your table all the way from Labor Day all the way till the frost. So that was the big things that he did. So in addition to working with Jaeger and identifying wild grape varieties, that was the stuff that he did. So he was kind of like, I guess, a concentration of his own because he was the only one doing this in isolation. But one thing that was also that he did is he wrote a book called "The Foundations of America." Yeah, what is it? Foundations of American Foundations.
Grape culture.
Yes. Okay. And you're going to find out that he was like, that was the textbook that many breeders started using after that was written. And people like Svensson that Clark had talked about, that's the book he used. My understanding, Jerry has that book and has spent some time with with things that way there too. So the other thing he did was he was an educator doing it that way, and I think he worked for the federal government, did some extension work that way. So now we're going to go to the next area, which is a true area of concentration where you have horticultural knowledge going on, and this is the Upper Midwest. And Clark talked about this a little bit. Is that their difficulty, their problem was that they had these eastern grapes that were growing, but they didn't want cool climate grapes. They wanted things that would live in the Arctic. They wanted like cold climate grapes. So a quick story about Elmer. I'll talk about Elmer Svensson a little bit later. I knew some people who knew him very, very well. He was a very, very funny guy. And he was trying to breed on his own grape varieties that would live in the Minnesota climate. So the one story I have about Svensson, which I think is kind of funny, is that someone asked him once, was it really hard developing these grapes while he had a dairy farm? It turns out he was a very devout Lutheran and was on the burial committee. And he kind of giggled and he said it was pretty hard, but not as hard as digging a grave in January in Minnesota. So he's just a funny guy. He's just a funny guy. And we retired, like people from miles around came to when we retired. So, but in the Upper Midwest, Svensson started the thing, and then at that point, the University of Minnesota picked up some of his work and then extended it further on and developed various varieties. So examples of Svensson bred varieties are like St. Pepin, but the Minnesota varieties that were done after Svensson moved on were like La Crescent and Marquette. And so you're still seeing this as a center that's actually a center of breeding and horticultural knowledge now, because in this area, you're still having breeders that are breeding new cold climate grapes. So guys like Tom Plaucher and Peter Hempstead, they are also developing their own varieties. So like Plaucher did like Verona, Crimson Pearl, and I think Peter Hempstead is coming up with his own set of varieties. And Peter Hempstead used to work at the University of Minnesota, but now he's working as a private breeder on his own. So what you're going to find out is that those areas. So like for instance, like in the Hudson Valley, they're not really breeding a lot of grapes anymore. And north of Boston, they're not doing it. So the center now for grape breeding is trying to get at cold climate grapes, and it's mostly the Minnesota area. The last area that had breeding would be Cornell University, and this will show like the unintended consequences of doing this. What they were trying to grow is, as Clark said, is like first table grapes, then wine grapes that would live in New York, Ohio, Massachusetts, that area. And they've got some successful grapes like Cayuga White, Chardonnay, Melody. And they have a new one called Aramella, I think is the name of the variety there.
That's right.
But yeah, but here's like an unintended consequences. It turns out the Chardonnay is a hybrid of Saval and Chardonnay, and they're trying to basically have it grow like a Saval but taste like a Chardonnay, and it kind of does both of those things. But it wasn't as popular because it wasn't as winter hardy as it needed to be for New England or the New York State area. But it turns out it's a very popular grape in Arkansas. So you'll see a lot of Chardonnay in Arkansas. So what I'm suggesting is that even if the breeder is trying to do certain things, it might be okay for his or her area, but it may be other people will pick it up and use it for their areas later on down the line. So I've talked about the concentrations of grape breeding in the U.S. What I'd like to kind of do now is shift over. So now you've got these grape varieties. What do you do with them? Many times they were new varieties, they were not tested. So what you had to do is like different growers in different parts of the country were growing these things and trying to figure out whether they would live in a certain area or not. So I'm just going to very quickly list those areas where they're grown, mostly to demonstrate how diverse the U.S. industry is as far as grape culture. Some of those areas still grow grapes. Some of those areas no longer grow grapes. But I just want to kind of give you an idea of like, first, now you got these grape varieties. Now you got to put them in the field to figure out what lives. So many, like sort of what Jerry's doing is like, and what I do with my place, I have about 100 different grape varieties. I'm trying to figure out what lives and what doesn't live, what kind of quality wine, so I can make recommendations to other growers. So those areas, you wouldn't think about Ohio. Ohio and the Cincinnati area was at one point, along with Minnesota, with Missouri, one of the big areas where you grew grapes in the 1840s to oh yes, yeah. Thank you for doing thanks for going to the next one. That's a Munson variety right there, Albany, which was talked about before. Thank you for doing that. I missed doing that. So what you can do now is now to the map, and that's our last slide. Thank you, Tom. So Cincinnati doesn't really grow a lot of grapes anymore, but at one point in the 1840s, the 1860s, it was one of the big areas for growing grapes, along with Missouri. That's no longer the case. But along Lake Erie in Ohio, like around the Bass Islands, there's still a lot of Native American grapes grown there. In New York State, there's a lot of grapes then and now that are grown in the Finger Lakes and in the Hudson Valley. Also, to the other very large area for grape growing in the northeast and the east of the Mississippi is the Lake Erie Grape Belt, and it's named because it's along Lake Erie, which kind of makes sense. So it is Ohio, Pennsylvania, and New York. So there's quite a few grapes that are grown in that area, and what they grow there is some for wine, but a lot for juice. So like Concord, Niagara. In the New York State area, they do a lot of Delaware, a lot of Diamond, some Catawba. So those are still pretty much in the offing as far as that for Native American varieties. Areas that don't grow grapes as much now, but did a long time ago, like say in the 1870s up to the 1920s, you wouldn't think about it, but North Carolina. They had a wine called Virginia Dare, and it's made of muscadines and Norton. So that's an area that at one point grew a fair amount of grapes, but that has since gone away a little bit. Southern New Jersey used to grow a real lot of grapes, and that's actually an area that's coming back as far as growing grapes. There's much more wineries being established in that area. So in southern New Jersey, they grew Norton, Humilian, which is a grape that was developed in the Hudson Valley, and Catawba. The St. Louis area was the big area for growing grapes in the 1860s. That has since receded, but you're seeing a reinsurgence as far as the number of grapes that are being grown, the number of wineries that are there, but they're in the same experimental stage of saying what will really live here. And I think of the Terravox thing is they're looking at like maybe the Munson varieties would do well in this part of the area. So you're seeing people experimenting to kind of like figure out what will live with these Native American grapes. The other two areas is Arkansas grows a lot of Concord, and Washington State obviously grows a lot of Concord, mostly for juice, but they do it that way. Kind of going back to the unintended consequences of breeding is the people who found grapes like Isabella, and Isabella was a chance spontaneously developed grape that was found somewhere in North Carolina, and it found its way to Brooklyn, and it found its way into a garden by Isabella Gibbs, and the Prince Nurseries found it, made cuttings, and started shipping and propagating it that way. So it was in the Garden of Isabella, so it's called Isabella. But you're finding out that there's probably 20, 30,000 acres of Isabella in Moldova, the Ukraine, believe it or not, India and Brazil. And then Guth, which is a grape variety that was developed by Rogers, is actually found in Brazil. And there's like 20,000 acres that makes mostly sparkling wine. A grape called Clinton, which was found on an island near Albany, New York, is grown extensively in Italy and Spain. There they call Clinto. So that's used quite a bit there. So I guess kind of in conclusion, I just try to give you a history of the North American grape varieties, who bred them, why they were bred, and that in the U.S. there's been this experimentation to figure out what of these many hundreds of different grape varieties can grow and where they can grow successfully. So that's kind of my spiel. What I'd like to do now is turn this over to Jerry of Terravox, who will talk about the Terravox project. So thank you very much. And thank you, Tom, for the clicking thing.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. As well as you've been told, I'm Jerry Eisterold with Terravox Vineyards. Like to talk a little bit about why we're doing this, and then a little bit about how we're doing it. I was told by my, well, right now, or last year, we had about 3,500 cases with a lot of different varieties. And if you do the math, that kind of tells you that there's not a lot of, it's not like we're producing pallets and pallets of any one grape and can sustain a wholesale supply chain. So this is all pretty much wine club and direct to consumer, internet sales, that sort of thing. My esteemed colleagues told me that I should begin this by talking about why we're doing it. And my first response is that I would think of a reason after the webinar. But on a little closer reflection, that it seemed like actually the reason was that since there was no reason to do this, no one would do it unless I did it. So that's kind of where it came from. It's also so my day job is doing museums, and museums, have a high cultural value. I mean, communities invest a lot of money in making them, but they're not necessarily fiscal moneymakers. So that's kind of another a part of it. It's very important not to think about the finances when you get into something like this. Stephen alluded to this book. So in the course of doing some museum work, I came across this book at a used bookstore in Lincoln, Nebraska, Thomas Volney Munson's Foundations of American Grape Culture. And in it, he described some 31 species of grapes that he had identified under Vitis genera. You will recognize vinifera is where most of the stuff in your that's in your liquor store comes from. There's also Labrusca, which is Concord and Welch's grape juice and things like that. But imagine if you were going down the street and there were 31 liquor stores and they all had the variety that you would find in the ones that are in the liquor stores that are there. There's a tremendous amount of genetic diversity sort of hidden behind this little chart here. And most of these varietals, these were just a couple of slides we threw together to make the point that most of the zones for these things impinge on Missouri, since we are at the boundary between the glaciated plains and the Ozark Highlands, the Mississippi Delta, the prairie, the woodlands. So there's more genetic diversity here in Missouri than in grapes, freshwater fishes, and songbirds than any other state. And then there's the just the protean figure of T.V. Munson, who was given the Legion of Honor by the grateful French nation, who does not give Americans this kind of award lightly. He was also a philosopher. Had the idea that it wasn't enough to just have an idea in your head; you had to work it out in the real world, and that's kind of akin to what we do in the in the trade. And there are monuments to the work that he did in France, which is also something that kind of implies that there was something very important about what he did. But where is his history now? And where were all those grapes and wines that he talked about in his book? And that kind of led to the very innocent question of like, what's going on here? And there's also a cultural history coming out of the Germans in Missouri that were all sort of forward-looking, very systematic in their approach to agriculture and viticulture, and trying to lay the groundwork for, a sustained indigenous industry going forward. There's Charles Valentine Riley is the Missouri State entomologist that discovered, along with Emile Planchon, the very complex life of the phylloxera. Hermann Jaeger, besides looking for grapes for rootstock, was developed the progenitors of most of the French American hybrids, at least the first the first group of breedings, and lots of other folks. I guess this blank slide represents the lost history that that was not there because because it was lost. So culturally, the project is sort of to take the work of Munson. This was the exhibit that he did at the 1893 Columbia Exposition, where he talked about all of the actually apples and grapes. If you look at all those little grape samples, and Stephen mentioned that he was trying to breed grapes that would ripen at any particular week of the ripening season, and how he did that in Chicago in the summer of 1893, I'm not sure, but what we're doing is kind of trying to extend his this legacy into the future and to see where it might be relevant. There's also kind of a missionary impulse in that this is a Concord grape developed by Ephraim Bull. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people that we've run across over the years think that American grapes are Labrusca, and they have that particular sort of foxy flavor. And we are trying to show them that there's a little bit more to the story than that. So now talk a little bit about sort of the work and how we did what we did. In a prior life, I began my college career in agronomy at the University of Missouri at the Soil Survey Lab. So we knew sort of the soil that we were looking for, rented a plane and flew around the region so that it would be close enough where we could actually commute to civilization for our own cultural life, but found this low soil There are very deep deposits along the Missouri River and in East Germany and in China, but it's very mineral rich. It's well drained. Not a lot of organic matter because you don't really like that. And it seemed the best sort of common denominator place to plant all these varieties, because we're also discovering that they're very, very sensitive to slight changes of exposure, soil conditions. So this is sort of the common denominator place for them. The next task was to find the grapes. Many of them came from the old TV Menson vineyard down in Denison, Texas, which is now the site of a community college. And by these vines had been essentially untended for decades. So that tells you that they were meant to live in this environment, because otherwise they would not be around anymore. But by getting cuttings from them over the course of about 16 years, that allowed us to establish like 12 vines of each of the varieties of interest. There's also some that came from UC Davis, from Geneva. There's a collector in Washington State. There's various small vineyards around the country, and some in Missouri. This was a variety called Munch, named after Friedrich Munch, who was one of the correspondents with with Munson in terms of exchanging scion and grape materials and so forth. We found this grape at the vineyard that was established by Friedrich's brother in Mount Pleasant in Augusta, Missouri. There were about a dozen of these grapes that Munson bred and named after his Missouri colleagues. So that's a theme. Munson bred, he sold commercially hundreds of these cultivars, bred thousands of them. In fact, for a while, I think there was one named after every member of his family and their middle names. In fact, he was making up names because he ran out of words in the English language for some of these. So to begin, this is we started planting this in 1996. The year 2000 was our first vintage. This bottle here is the entire vintage of the year 2000. It's a couple of berries of this and a couple of berries of that. It is a bottle that will never be opened because it's better as a story than as actual wine, which I'm sure is god awful. But for the first number of years, it was all, the winemaking was very casual and kind of on the Tom Sawyer model of, hey, wouldn't it be fun to come up and work in the vineyards, and then next season you'd have to make a new set of friends because they were sort of wise to the game. But this particular year, since you're just doing it in between times and between actual paying jobs, we had, I think, 12 different vintages of Norton, and we ran into Clark. Clark came out and blended 3 of these, took it back to California where it got a double gold, and that was sort of an indication that there might be something of quality in all this. And another year, my wife, who is French, drank some of this and actually announced that she would put it in her mouth willingly. And that was another sort of high mark, and convinced that there was promise here. So Clark, I think when he came here, we had over 110 or 117 lots of wine. In 2016, we were down to 67. I was going to show the whole chart, but you can't read any of the type if I do that. So this is just to make the point. And in, let's see, where are we? In 2020, we're down to, double click on the 26 lots. So yeah, we're trying to rationalize on getting a fewer of these varietals. But there's still, so there's a class of, like we're making a bunch where we can at least have a pallet or a barrel of this stuff. There's another sort of tranche that we're still sort of iffy, because trying it to plant it over here or over there, where the jury is sort of out, literally. We are trying to, working with advice where we can get it. Misha Kwiatkowski from the University of Missouri, I think his great piece of wisdom was, I think he said, beware of people from afar bearing numbers, because these grapes just do not behave as others do. So we are literally at the like faced with writing the book on this stuff. We're collecting a lot of data, doing a lot of A/B testing, and trying out different propagation and cultivation methods. This is Dean Wallenberg, also the University of Missouri. We're doing testing for viruses and insect pressures and things like that. As I mentioned, they're sensitive to the same grape on a southern slope or a northern slope or at the bottom of the hill or the top of the hill behave differently. So we're trying to move towards having at least two variables in the plantings that we have so we can evaluate that. We're doing a lot of testing in the winemaking. This was an experiment with natural yeasts, and I can tell you the answer to that experiment is hell no. We're doing things like trying to capture the aromatics of some of these grapes. The Albania was we made a wine from the juice, from the pulp, and from the skins, and then back blended those three together, which makes a fairly nice and complex little wine. We are where we have enough fruit to play with. This is deconstructing Norton. It's making a rosé, a normal process, reductive process, making an oxidized rosé, and then making a wine from the result, as well as making a port, which is, if I may say, one of the better ports I've had. And this is a white grape called Wetumpka, which when it's ripening out in the vineyard, the whole world smells of elderberry flowers. It's wonderfully aromatic. Clark came out and noted that it had enough acid to sort of sustain fortification. So there's a white port that we make out of it that is also pretty darn good. And kind of by accident, we discovered if you ignore a barrel for 5 years and it oxidizes half away, it makes something that is almost tastes like single malt Scotch. So there are flavor profiles in these things that you just don't find in other grapes. There's a lot of evaluation and testing. And I think one of the secrets to the fact that some of the wines we're putting out are pretty darn good is that a lot of it has gone down the drain. We can't afford to let anything get out the door that is not a good ambassador for this little venture. And there's a lot of A/B testing and sampling, and yeah, it's a lot of work. There came a point, though, at which instead of just going out there and looking at grapes and harvesting them without even measuring the bricks, we should probably get a little more systematic about it. So that's when Clark entered the picture, since if anybody can be systematic about anything, it seemed like it might be he. So with Clark, take it away.
Thanks, Jerry. So I think what Jerry has described here is that his original intention was not commercial. He's a museum designer, and so he decided to turn his backyard into a living museum with no thought to whether it would ever make any money. And so they brought me in. I originally, if you saw those little brown bottles, I originally was sent a whole box full of these goofy little brown bottles with Beacon and America and all these varieties that I had never heard of. And I thought, this has got to be some kind of joke. But then I tasted the wines, and some of them were kind of good. And so I came out in 2012. That picture you saw of me was when they were just getting at the end of pruning in, I guess it was February. And one of the things I noticed is that everything was cordon trained. And so I found out they had, a great big planting of Norton, and they were only getting 1 barrel out of the whole thing, about 1/8 of a ton per acre. And that was because they were pruning it the wrong way. Norton has to be cane pruned, not cordon pruned, spur pruned. And so I got them to stop. They had already pruned 80% of the vineyard, but we did what was left over. We did that right, and then we got about, I guess, 3 barrels. And now that we're doing the whole vineyard that way and we're doing it properly, we're getting 30 or 40 barrels off the same planting. So that was a kind of rationalization that I was able to start with. Let me show you. This is the Tractor Palace. This is where they were making wine ever since the beginning. And by my count, they actually had 160 carboys. that they were having to take care of. And I had just gotten back from Gallo Livingston, where I was coaching those guys, and they only had 70 tanks. So I said, Jerry, you've got more than twice as many and chemical analyses to do as Gallo Livingston, for Pete's sake. And so we started to try to rationalize it, get into larger containers, and trim down the wines we were working with to the ones that really worked well. Here's what it looked like then. So that's how they were doing, just everything was siphoned, and just a really primitive sort of overgrown home winemaking setup. So we laid out a winery, and this is what it looked like in May of 2012. Big hole in the ground. And then here we are in the brand new winery. We're still in Carboys, but this is the winery in 2013. And now today we've got a real professional setup with a lot of barrels. We really like these on the left here, these Flex Tank Apollo eggs, and minimizing our breakdown cooperage, particularly trying to minimize the amount of glass that we have in the winery. Just another contrast here is, this is on the left is the press they were using in 2014, and on the right is in 2022, we got a new Euro press. And so we've really moved into the modern age, and we're making a lot of wine, very good wine. And now I think we're going to show you some of our successes. So Jerry, why don't you take over here?
Yeah. So in the main, what we're trying to do is see what each of these cultivars has to say. So we're working with them as single cultivars, but at the same time doing a red blend and a white blend. We are in Platte County, Missouri, so our blend is Chateauneuf du Platte. The French are allowed only 13 varietals in Chateauneuf, and we have 60, so there. You'll notice that the Albania TTB would not allow us to put the word on the label, fearing that we were defrauding the public, in that we had grapes from Albania. So it's printed backwards as a fanciful name that gets us by that. We also have a grape called America, but they were onto us and wouldn't allow to do the same thing. We'll have to figure that out. But yeah, so there's all of these that we are trying to kind of elevate them into their place in the sun and make people aware of them. So to go through, so each of these, as I said, we're keeping a lot of documentation to see what these grapes have to, how they're like, how they want to grow. You'll notice the notes up above will say Wetumpka. I showed a little bit about that earlier. It's a Labrusca vinifera. I don't know how to pronounce these words. Estevelis. So
Orkiniana.
Thank you. So there's a lot of bloodlines that go into this, but this one, I mentioned the aromatics. It's really great. It's a very kind of droopy vine, needs a lot of tending during the season, and it shatters really easily. We love the grape, but if you miss your window of about 3 days to harvest this thing, it's all on the ground. But the wine is pretty darn interesting.
So yeah, this grape has a lot of acidity, and it has these wonderful aromatics. I'm mentioning green pineapple, pear, honeysuckle, really bracing acidity, and it's the closest thing to a vinifera would be a sylvaner. So I put together this flavor map. We've got decreasing tannin on the left, and then decreasing color on the right, so that we end up with white wines over on the right and red wines on the left with different degrees of tannin. I'm going to place Wetumpka up here near the Mosel, where we have a crisp white with good acidity.
And here we have Hidalgo, a very kind of robust wine. It didn't like the winter last year a little bit, so we're sort of studying that. It's like huge, just gorgeous clusters, kind of slightly green fruit. Really responds well to ML. It's hard to describe it. To me, it's a very unctuous, oily kind of wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Clark, the wine.
Yeah, so I'm kind of likening it to Pinot Grigio. It doesn't have as much acidity as with Tumka, but it does have a lot of body, and you get these aromas of lychee and peach and ripe, sort of tropical, ripe pineapple and rich body. So in the flavor space here, I'm placing this sort of between the Rheingau and the Alsatian wines. As the closest thing is a Pinot Grigio, maybe from Alsace.
And here we have Albania. That's been mentioned a couple of times. So this, well, one of the oddities is it seems to be bifurcating into kind of a long red caned grape and a kind of gnarly white cane grape, but some of this is happening on the same plant. So it's sort of splitting into two populations. We theorize it's a virus of some type, but of the grapes, it makes something that's, I think, one of the more sort of classically vinifera-like, at least by my lights.
Yeah, this is my favorite white grape. I'm likening it to Corton. You have complex aromas. I'm saying jasmine, kiwi, mint, golden delicious apple, and racy acidity or even minerality. So I'm placing it down here near Corton and Savinier, which is the Loire Valley, Chenin Blanc, Chablis, that kind of wine. It's for people that have never had a non-vinifera. This is probably the most compelling variety to try, as long as you know how to spell backwards.
And Munch, you showed you a picture of this earlier. This is named after Friedrich Munch. What can I say about that? It's nice, strong growth patterns. We have actually, when Mount Pleasant, the winery that we got the cuttings from originally, when I bought wine from them way back in the 90s when they still made this, it was like an inky dark brown wine. Now we've all gone so far as to make an almost white wine or maybe a rosé from it. It's got a wide range at which you can treat it to make a viable wine, regardless of the coloration. So it's, like I said, some of these grapes just don't behave the way you think they should.
Yeah, this stuff on the vine, it's got lots of color, and we've never really quite cracked the code about how to get all that out and make a highly colored wine, although we've seen them. We generally get something that's a little lighter on its feet, and the thing that marks this grape is fresh strawberry. It's just loaded with it, whether you make it as a rosé or a Beaujolais style, maybe throw in banana and apricot flavors, bright finish, early consumption. It doesn't have a lot of tannin. And so I'm placing it right there between Beaujolais and Rosé d'Anjou.
And Lenore. Lenore is a pre-Munson grape. I think it comes back from the 1830s.
Yeah.
Once widely planted down south. In fact, we found plantings of this in France and Italy. There was a 140-year-old vineyard out there where they just loved it. They're not allowed to grow this wine commercially, but it's really robust. I will say, if you don't treat it right, it can sort of have a kind of plastic lead pencil flavor, and we're we're also trying to learn whether it likes sunlight or a shaded canopy. Anyway, it's just something that we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah, so now here you end up with a wine with sort of almost the opposite of Munch in that it has lots of color but very soft tannins, and so I'm likening it to a dolcetto. You have these deep red color, but very drinkable with this jammy boysenberry, elderberry, and some complexity, a little bit of mushroom character. And so I'm placing that over here near the richer or Burgundian wines and Dolcetto.
And now we have Lamanto. Lamanto is a variety that has some plantings down in Texas. It's really does not produce a lot of sugar. But so I think one year we were only able to get like 7% alcohol out of it. So it became, I don't know, party favors or something. But when it's on. It can make a wonderfully powerful red wine, even though it doesn't have a lot of alcohol to it, which could be a good thing.
Yeah, just I forgot to mention that Lenoir is planted all over Texas, but it's mostly known as Black Spanish. Same stuff. So this one makes a medium-bodied red with really complex aromas. It seems the Borquignana seems to always impart an aroma of honey that's really what I want to say, interesting and complexing note, along with blackberries and wildflowers. So it's very drinkable, but very complex. And so I'm putting it down here near the Chianti with moderate tannin and moderate color.
And then our friend Norton, also called Virginia Seedling, probably the most disease resistant, luxuriant growth, even perhaps to a fault. I mean, we really have to keep on top of thinning out the canopy on this guy. But yeah, there's it'll hang on the vine for forever, even unto after frost. So I think it takes what we've learned there is patience to like let it really ripen until the seeds get fully dark, and not pull the trigger and harvest the thing too early. But it goes all the way here. I know that Clark mentioned some places have trouble ripening it all the way, but we do not.
Yeah, we found out growing this in Clarksburg in long rows adjacent to vinifera. It's really not a very good idea. It needs to be cane pruned, but it also hates sulfur. So it sort of likes to be over by itself. The wine is often compared to Rhone wine, dark purple, blueberry aromas, a little toffee, black pepper, tobacco. And it's very dense, but it has that should say plush tannins. There's something that enrobes the tannins so that they don't come off as harsh at all, and so it can handle a little more acidity, but just very generous in flavor and color.
And Cloida. Probably the prettiest grape of the blue black dark ones, and to me, yeah, I mean, it yields sort of coffee and chocolate and lots of interesting flavors. It's one of my, if not my favorite of the dark grapes.
Well, I feel like that too. Moderate acidity, a little more tannin, or let's say astringent impression than some of the others. And this pomegranate thing just comes right at you, complexed up by a little bit of bell pepper. So it's a little bit like a Cabernet. I've placed it down here at sort of a moderate to high tannin and a little less color. In the you know, I think a Rioja is probably like a Tempranillo is probably the closest thing.
And then lastly, you know, there's a lot of sweat equity into that goes into this. It's not all my sweat though. There's I thought I'd give a nod to Michael on the left, who does sales and marketing, Jean-Louis, the winemaker. There's me, Sabrina, the assistant winemaker, vineyard person, and Nicole that does events. So between us, we hope to get the word out and get people to try these things, even though you got to pick up a bottle and try it because you don't know what's inside until you open it. So thank you. I think that's the presentation. Tom?
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Clark. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, Stephen. We've got a few questions here that we want to get to before we end this. The first one I want to start with came in, and the question was, I think this is for Jerry. Jerry, what have you found that motivates folks to purchase wines they've never heard of before?
I'll let you know as soon as I. No, I mean they have. Well, they either have to be older and jaded and been around the block and want to try something new, or younger without sort of ossified opinions about what is right and what is wrong, and kind of willing to explore. And you know, to explore, you have to be sort of comfortable enough to kind of range inside an environment. That's a very generalized response. You got to get them curious, and hopefully, if they see other people enjoying it, they will.
We have another question that comes in with regard to cultivation, and I think this one is probably going to be for both Jerry and Clark. Are any of the varieties you've discussed suitable for organic or no spray production?
Well, I think Norton is probably the best choice. You know, you can't spray it, and of course it's extremely tolerant to disease. And what else would you suggest there, Jerry? And it's kind of true across the board that these need less sprays and care than vinifera varieties.
Well, I mean, just philosophically, we're trying to like get by with as little chemical intervention as possible. You want to promote diversity in the soil, diversity in the canopy. It's the fungal pressures that we're still scratching our heads with and trying to see what we can, you know, if that's a matter of canopy pruning. I mean, that's the thing that we're still trying to poke around at.
Yeah, it's going to matter a lot where you plant the grape. We're not able to go completely organic because of our humidity.
Yeah.
Speaking of where you plant the grape, we have another question here. And the question, I think this is to maybe all three of you. How prevalent is the cultivation of the Munson varieties around the country and around the world?
Well, if I can broaden that a little bit, like Herbemont and Lenore, which are sort of pre-Munson varietals, we found little smatterings of those in all 6 continents. I mean, they're all over the place, but you know, by DOC or DOCG regulations, they're not allowed to be made commercially. So we keep being surprised by little pockets that we're finding here and there. But with prohibition, you know, all of that work just sort of went out the window, and that's the sort of the lost city of Vitis that we're trying to recapture.
Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit. That you know, the timing wasn't good for starting to get into these varieties. We had Prohibition came along and kind of knocked out winemaking in general, and then we had the Depression, and then we had World War I and World War II. And when the GIs came back, those were, for example, in California, we were making nothing but port and sherry until about 1965. So everything was just grown for high alcohol and high yields and stuff. And people they didn't even know what varieties were. The ones that did, the GIs coming back in 1945, had many of them developed a taste for German wines and French wines and just table wines in general, but they weren't looking to even California to buy their table wines. They would buy them from France and Germany and Spain and Italy, and now I think we're starting to move beyond vinifera just because people are getting a little bored and getting a little curious, and it's a perfect time for exploring these new varieties. And so there's a lot more write-ups of them, encouragement for people to try them. It's a moment in time that we've been waiting for over a century.
I have a question here that I think might go best to Stephen. The question is, does the Cape grape used by Dufour in Vevey, Indiana, 1802 to 1830s still exist? Does that sound familiar, Stephen?
I've heard of the grape variety, and I think it's still around. I don't think it's really grown a lot, but if you go to like the Geneva germplasm, I call it the grape arc. There's basically a place that has two of a bunch of different grape varieties, and I believe that is still around. Yes, so you can basically call them, get cuttings, and many of the grapes the 100 varieties that I grow, I got them either from old time growers, but I want to verify that's what they were. But I got them from Geneva, so there's a few there, and I get cuttings, propagate them myself, and then put them out in the field, stuff like that. So
this next question is for Jerry. Jerry, do you think new and fairly unknown varietals have a future sales opportunity in top export markets?
Yeah. I mean, we have been approached by people that really want, because there are people that want to try something new and unusual, and if only for bragging rights and things like that. Right now, we just don't have the production to support, like foreign export or anything like that. But been approached with interest because it's well, as you know, it's a well, I think this is something. Maybe this came from Clark. One of his bon mots was that the wine is 85% story and 15% what's in the bottle. So it's a heck of a story that should get people interested in trying this stuff.
One last question here, and this is for all three of you. If you had to choose one of the whites and one of the reds of the Munson varieties to cultivate and produce into wine on a regular basis, vintage in and vintage out, which would they be? Let's start with Clark.
Well, of course, Norton isn't really a Munson variety. It's what he based a lot of his stuff on. But of the wines in the collection, that's certainly the one that I love the best, followed closely by Lamanto. And with the whites, there's just no question that Albania is my favorite.
Jerry?
I think I'd have to take the Fifth Amendment because as per the previous question, the whole idea is to promote diversity. We got to get people to try a bunch of these things and not just one.
Stephen, do you have any thoughts?
But I would say, and I'll help Jerry out in this respect. The other way you could answer it, I've heard this many times. It's like picking one of my children. They're all my favorites. I get you out of the whole thing. So I don't really grow a lot of Munson hybrids, but the ones that I do grow, I grow Captivator, which is actually a Rogers-based hybrid, and I grow Bell. So I grow Manito. Those are the only three that I grow, and they're all really lovely. But I like Captivator because actually it has a lot of the Rogers stuff in it. So anyway, but that's the only three that I grow in the Hudson Valley. So, but they were all good. So,
well, thank you all again very much, and I want to thank all the attendees for attending, for listening. Again, this is not a subject that's discussed all that much, but the interest is growing, and it's growing significantly from the input that we're all hearing. This presentation has been recorded. We'll make it available after a little bit of editing. And when we do, we will send out an email to all of you, letting you know where you can find it, along with contact information for all of us. And so with that, again, I want to thank you all for attending, and have a good day. Goodbye.
thank you. Okay.